Hello there, my name is Charlie Maher. I'm the Global Director for Process and Manufacturing Technology. I'd like to introduce Beth Haas. She's one of our principal consultants who specializes in technology transfer. We're going to have a conversation today about technology transfer best practices. Beth?
Hi, everybody. We're going to talk today about technology transfer and some of the things that you can do to make it a little bit easier for your organization. Next. When performing a technology transfer, you have to think, well, what is it first? So, in my mind, you have to separate that technology transfer into specific stages, and we're going to talk about that. Next, we want to cross-link activities and deliverables and know what stage those need to happen. There are a lot of moving parts, and it's a puzzle that has to be solved. A fun puzzle for some people, and I think it's kind of fun and very satisfying when it works. But the trick is that every tech transfer is unique, and it makes standardization very difficult. Technology transfer is essentially product realization. It fits right in with the product life cycle that's presented in ICH Q10. From product concept, product development, then which shows technology transfer, commercial manufacture, and product discontinuation. But the reality is that technology transfer really spans the whole life cycle. It should start in product concept, move with it into product development. Obviously, the culmination is with commercial manufacture, and sometimes it actually goes into product discontinuation. If the reason that you're doing the discontinuation is to transfer that product to another location. Technology transfer implements the product and process knowledge to achieve operational readiness that completes all the CMC requirements needed for filing and regulatory approvals. Before you start your technology transfer, it's really important to understand what classifications it falls under. There are two classifications that I often look at. The first is the life cycle phase. That's everything that starts with clinical to clinical. So if you're transferring, say, from clinical stage 1 to clinical stage 2 to stage 3, or stage 3 to commercial, these CMC requirements are only going to be a subset of what you really have to implement for commercial manufacture. Clinical phase 3, once you reach that point, it needs to be paralleling your tech transfer program, because the CMC requirements should be starting to get put in place, and all the elements that are needed should be, for the knowledge transfer, should be getting developed. Development commercial is often talked about for technology transfer, and that's essentially the same thing as clinical phase 3 to marketed product. This terminology is often used for APIs or drug substances because they don't have the same use of the clinical phases when they do their new product development. And then finally, there's the commercial to commercial, and this is essentially just the transfer of a marketed product from one manufacturing location to a new one. So you need to really understand where you are in that life cycle phase to know what elements of the CMC need to be transferred. Next is knowing the implications of your sending unit and your receiving unit sites, and what implications those would entail are dependent on whether that site's internal or external to your organization. So the first kind of transfer you may do is an internal to internal transfer. So that's where you're going from one internal site to another internal site. These are usually considered the easiest kind of technology transfers because there's integrated systems that will help you to streamline that knowledge transfer. There's interconnectivity, there's cooperation between sites. All of that is already in place. However, the only consideration for internal to internal is you might want to consider the impact if you're going global with that. For instance, if you're moving from a US site to an EU site or an Asia site, those tech transfers have to then incorporate the considerations for language barriers, maybe communications, and also interpretations of the quality management system. The next is internal to external or external to internal. This is where the internal site is typically the marketing authorization holder and is the one legally responsible for that technology transfer and that product. They are the ones that need to have complete oversight of whatever's happening at the external manufacturer. So they're likely going to have their own team as well as a team for tech transfer at both locations in order to facilitate that oversight. The final one is the external to external transfers. And in my mind, these are the most complex for knowledge transfer because it's not always easy for those two sites to talk to each other and facilitate that knowledge transfer. Many times in these instances, the marketing authorization holder has to act as the middle person to provide the knowledge from one site to another, depending on how the business contracts have been established. That can make it very difficult for ensuring knowledge transfer. The FDA also requires that you have a technology transfer process in place. This is just an example of one. It's a 5-stage process starting from feasibility, going through qualification. You may add more stages for your organization and the level of oversight your organization wants to have. I recommend having checkpoints between each stage so that you can have a steering committee approve and agree that the activities and deliverables have been accomplished to the point where they want to take the risk to move on. Next. So if you're looking at these stages using this 5-stage approach, you think, well, where does the technology transfer actually begin? And this is actually really important because oftentimes the technology transfer doesn't start until the business decision has been made, 1, to perform the technology transfer, and 2, to actually figure out where the receiving unit's going to be. So they might come in and start working on the technology transfer in the project risk stage, determining where those risk factors are. But at that point, the business strategy is already set. Oftentimes, I see that technology transfer teams are not formed until even after the project risk phase. They're saying, okay, we've assessed the risk and we agree we're going to move forward. So now let's just do the knowledge transfer. The problem with that is that you need to look at these technical aspects and assess them a little earlier, all the way back into feasibility, just to determine if there's going to be something that's going to impact the business goals for that technology transfer. Next. It's also important to have the right technology transfer team in place. First of all, you need to have a solid technology transfer project manager assigned to coordinate all the cross-functional requirements and have knowledge of what the CMC needs will be for that technology transfer. These teams have a broad range of functional experience. Obviously, first there's the business team. They start out setting that strategy, finding the customers, knowing the markets. The next is your tech transfer PM, leading that team. You have to have process knowledge for process chemistry and engineering. Analytical is a key piece covering raw materials and process controls, product stability, covering both development and quality control functions in the organization. Then you have engineering. That's for capital installation and qualification. Manufacturing is often needed much early in a technology transfer to know that your operational readiness is going to be established with the knowledge transfer that's occurring. Regulatory is a key piece because they set the strategy, and that strategy needs to be known and should not change very much throughout the technology transfer. Quality is an integral part across all these functional areas, approving documents, establishing the QMS, and knowing that everything's being done from a compliance standpoint. And finally, sourcing and supply chain are important for production planning, logistics, and material sourcing to identify long lead items and plant windows that are needed for the transfer. And as I mentioned before, you may need separate teams that are cross-functional at both the sending and receiving sites. So let's talk about what makes a tech transfer be successful. I always advocate that you set boundaries for the tech transfer, establishing what it's going to be, its endpoint, and that endpoint would be what defines its success. Some people would say, well, process validation, batch release using right first time execution is what's important for this tech transfer. Other places might say, well, once the regulatory filing is submitted, that would denote the end of the tech transfer, or even further than that, going all the way to PAI approval. Others are the budget goals being achieved and the time to market requirements. So you've done it in the time that's needed. And finally, it may not be over until there's an official handover to the commercial team, knowing that everything's in place for full operational readiness. Knowing these success factors up front is important to understand how to prioritize your tech transfers. And the last slide I have here is on touch points. And the touch point that I'm going to talk about today is, well, you know, you've done all this. You have a tech transfer process. You have a tech transfer PM that's really strong. You have a dedicated cross-functional team and a clear charter. So what's so hard? Why is it still having problems with the knowledge transfer and getting the process ready? What keeps it from being standardized and streamlined? And a main aspect in my mind from all the tech transfers I've done is that sometimes there's a lack of transparency between the sending and receiving units. They don't always have the ability to communicate openly, and they might have to use a middleman. So that's a problem because, you know, your knowledge transfer is now playing telephone. The next thing is I'm going to go back. The next thing is the communication that's established between the sending and receiving units is often set by contractual agreements. So you need to be careful in those contractual agreements if it's important for the technology transfer to have a streamlined knowledge management system to ensure that those contractual agreements align with the communication that's required. And then we need early agreement on regulatory strategy and the markets involved. The earlier you can get that in place, the better for technology transfer. Often markets might be added or the strategy might change midstream on a technology transfer, and that completely impacts the timeline and involvement of some of the functional areas. As we discussed, technical risks might not have been assessed soon enough. And so you might learn some information when you start doing that knowledge transfer that will impact business goals and the boundaries and assumptions that we use to establish the tech transfer. And finally, you know, having the ability to leverage your testing requirements at the sending unit or external labs and being able to synergize between all of the units can allow your tech transfer to become streamlined should the tech contractual agreements be established so you can do so. So I hope that you've learned a little bit today about technology transfer and what you can do from a best practice standpoint to help you perform them in your organization.
Well, Beth, thank you very much for that discussion. I appreciate it. And look forward to having conversations with our potential clients. And I'd like to share with you our contact information worldwide. Of course, I'm available to have a conversation about your tech transfer needs, as is Beth. In Europe and Asia, we have worldwide teams that are able to support your needs. Those contacts are also provided on this slide.